Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. This time, we're taking a journey on the Underground Railroad. We're going to go beyond the well-known stories like Harriet Tubman and the North Star and explore some surprising stories about ingenuity and escapes.
Oh, yeah.
The unintended consequences that fueled the fire leading up to the Civil War.
Yeah.
For example, did you know that the Underground Railroad wasn't actually a single organization?
Right.
Or that Southern slave owners were more terrified of it than the reality warranted?
Hmm.
Let's dive in and find out why.
Well, to really understand the Underground Railroad, I think we have to remember the context.
Yeah.
We're talking about the 1830s to the 1850s,
Yeah.
a time when slavery was expanding westward, the abolitionist movement was gaining momentum, and the political climate, incredibly tense.
And speaking of tense, this tension played out in a really symbolic way in Washington, D.C., the nation's capital,
Right.
a symbol of freedom and democracy, yet also a major hub for the slave trade. It's like
Yeah.
the heart of the storm.
It definitely highlights the hypocrisy of the time.
Right.
You have political elites debating liberty and freedom while simultaneously owning slaves.
Now let's start with Josiah Henson, who escaped slavery with his family in 1830 and eventually made his way to Canada.
Now, Canada was crucial because of the Fugitive Slave Act.
Right.
See, escaping to northern states wasn't enough.
Right.
Enslaved people could still be captured and returned to their owners. But Canada offered true sanctuary.
And Henson's story is fascinating. Arrives in Canada free, but faces poverty and discrimination. Imagine living in a former pig shanty. Yet despite these hardships, he was driven to help others.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
He becomes a conductor on the Underground Railroad, risking his own freedom to guide others to safety. It's estimated that he helped over 100 people escape to Canada.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah.
What stands out to you about Henson's story?
Well, I think Henson understood that true freedom required more than just escaping.
Right.
He founded the Dawn Institute in Ontario. This is a community, and it was focused on education and self-sufficiency for those fleeing slavery.
So this wasn't just a refuge, but a place to really empower formerly enslaved people.
Exactly. Gave them the tools and resources to build new lives. And, this had a ripple effect. It inspired the creation of similar communities across Canada.
So now for a different kind of story, let's talk about Jonathan Walker, a white abolitionist sea captain who made a bold and risky decision.
So escaping from the Deep South, especially by land, was incredibly difficult. And in 1844, Walker decides to sail south to the Bahamas with 7 runaway slaves.
Wow, so a 25-foot whaleboat battling storms, illness, dwindling supplies.
Yeah.
It must have been incredibly harrowing.
They almost made it, just a day away from freedom, and then betrayal. They're captured in Biscayne Bay.
What happened next?
Walker's punishment was shocking.
Okay.
Branded with the letters SS for slave stealer,
Wow.
a punishment usually reserved for slaves.
That's a really powerful symbol of how seriously the South viewed these attempts to help enslaved people escape. This must have had a significant impact on the public perception of the Underground Railroad.
Oh, absolutely. It fueled outrage in the North and intensified Southern paranoia about the power and reach of the Underground Railroad. It's a turning point, I think, where these individual acts of resistance start to have larger political consequences.
So all of this is happening against a backdrop of growing division within the country.
Right.
We have figures like Frederick Douglass, a former slave whose powerful speeches helped humanize the issue for many in the North.
His eloquence, his firsthand accounts contrasted sharply with the pro-slavery ideology that was taking root in the South.
It seems like two very different versions of reality were emerging.
Absolutely. You see so-called scientific and biblical justifications for slavery gaining traction in the South. They felt increasingly under attack and more determined to defend their way of life.
But despite this growing reputation, the Underground Railroad was limited in scope. Particularly in the Deep South, it primarily operated in border states.
That's right. However, events like the escape of 77 slaves on the schooner Pearl in 1848 further inflamed tensions and really highlighted the limitations of Southern control.
And this escape took place in Washington, D.C.,
Right.
once again highlighting the city's vulnerability.
And what's fascinating is that these weren't just any slaves.
Right.
Some belonged to very prominent figures, including a U.S. congressman and even former First Lady Dolly Madison.
Wow.
So this amplified the sense of betrayal and outrage among Southern slave owners.
I can only imagine the reaction.
Slave owners feeling deeply threatened called for a crackdown on the Underground Railroad. And the betrayal in this case was especially jarring. It was a black driver who informed the authorities,
Oh, wow.
possibly motivated by reward money or fear of reprisal. the captured fugitives. Sold further south, separating families as punishment. It was a devastating outcome that underscored the stakes involved.
So we've talked about the risks, the consequences, and the growing political fallout. But what about the ingenuity of these escapes?
Oh, yeah.
The story of William and Ellen Craft comes to mind. Their plan was incredibly audacious.
Right. Ellen, who was light-skinned, disguised herself as a white male slave owner, with William posing as her servant. They relied on the prevailing social norms to make their escape.
It's an incredible story and really a testament to their courage and quick thinking.
Right.
It makes you wonder how many other similar escapes might have taken place that we simply don't know about.
There were undoubtedly countless acts of courage and resilience that went unrecorded. But stories like the Crafts captured the public imagination and further fueled the debate over slavery.
Speaking of audacious escapes, have you heard of Henry Box Brown?
Of course.
Yeah.
He literally mailed himself to freedom in a crate.
Wow.
The discomfort, the danger. But ultimately, the success of his plan is remarkable.
It's a testament to the human desire for freedom and the lengths to which people would go to achieve it.
Precisely. And these stories were spreading, solidifying the idea of the Underground Railroad as this powerful force, even if the reality was more nuanced. It challenged the notion that slavery was an unbreakable system.
And all of this is happening as the political landscape is shifting yet again with the Compromise of 1850.
Yeah.
This was meant to ease tensions, but it came at a price.
One part of that price was the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, a much harsher law that would have a profound impact on the Underground Railroad and the lives of those escaping slavery.
This new act seems like a major turning point.
It was. It required citizen participation in capturing runaway slaves and denied fugitives the right to a trial.
Wow.
It was a huge step backwards for those who opposed slavery.
So what was the immediate impact of this new law?
Fear. Fear gripped communities in the North. Slave catchers became emboldened, and thousands of escaped slaves fled to Canada fearing recapture. The act created a new level of urgency and danger for those seeking freedom.
It's heartbreaking to think about the impact this must have had on those who had already risked so much to escape. One story that stands out is that of James Hamlet, the first person captured under this new law.
His story
Yeah.
is a powerful illustration of the Fugitive Slave Act's reach.
So Hamlet was living a free life in New York City when he was arrested and sent back to Baltimore.
Right.
Can you imagine that feeling?
Yeah.
Of utter helplessness.
Yeah.
You've built a life only to have it ripped away.
It was a devastating blow to the abolitionist movement and a stark reminder of the challenges that lay ahead. You know, that Fugitive Slave Act really threw a wrench into the workings of the Underground Railroad.
Yeah.
But it also had this unintended consequence
Okay.
of galvanizing the abolitionist movement.
It seems counterintuitive that something so oppressive could actually strengthen the opposition.
It is. It's a classic example of backlash. You know, when you try to suppress a movement too forcefully, you often create the opposite effect.
Right.
And the act backfired by generating even more sympathy for escaped slaves, even among those who had previously been indifferent.
Yeah, it's like shining a light on a problem that some people would rather ignore.
Exactly. And this is where figures like Harriet Tubman become even more significant. You know, her story takes on a new dimension in the context of this harsh law.
We all know about Harriet Tubman, the Moses of her people,
Right.
who guided hundreds to freedom. But what's fascinating is that she didn't stop after her own escape.
No. Tubman escaped in 1849, just a year before the Fugitive Slave Act was passed. Yet she couldn't bear the thought of her family remaining enslaved. So in 1850, she went back to Maryland to rescue her sister and her sister's 2 children.
It's hard to grasp the courage it took to return knowing the risks involved. I mean, capture meant certain death, or worse.
It wasn't a simple journey. They traveled at night, relied on this network of safe houses and guides that comprised the Underground Railroad.
Right.
Every step was filled with danger.
And beyond the physical dangers, there must have been immense psychological pressure, knowing they could be caught at any moment.
Absolutely. Tubman's unwavering faith, her resourcefulness, and her ability to inspire hope were crucial, I think, for their survival.
Tubman's story is often highlighted, but it's important to remember that she wasn't alone. There were countless other conductors, both black and white, who played crucial roles.
Yeah, these were ordinary people, motivated by a deep sense of morality and justice. Farmers, shopkeepers, ministers, housewives, people from all walks of life who saw the evil of slavery and chose to act.
And their efforts weren't limited to just guiding people north.
Right.
What about those who worked to protect escaped slaves once they reached northern cities?
Vigilance committees formed in northern cities specifically to protect escaped slaves from being captured and returned to slavery.
So these committees were actively working against the Fugitive Slave Act.
They were. These committees often comprised abolitionists, free black communities, and sympathetic whites. They raised money to buy freedom for those captured, provided legal assistance, and even organized daring rescues.
These rescues must have been incredibly risky. I mean, they directly challenged the Fugitive Slave Act and the authority of the federal government. Weren't they afraid of the consequences?
Of course. But for many, the moral imperative to fight slavery outweighed those personal risks. They were willing to put everything on the line for what they believed in.
One particularly dramatic case involves Shadrach Minkins. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. In 1851, Shadrach Minkins was arrested in Boston under the Fugitive Slave Act.
Okay.
A group of black abolitionists, led by Lewis Hayden, stormed the courthouse and whisked Minkins away to safety.
That's incredible. Such a bold and very public act of defiance.
It was, and it sent a message that the abolitionist movement wouldn't be intimidated by the Fugitive Slave Act.
These actions were incredibly brave.
Yeah,
I mean, they faced imprisonment, fines, and even violence for their actions.
they did. But, the desire for justice often outweighs the fear of reprisal. It's this unwavering belief in the inherent wrongness of slavery that fueled the Underground Railroad.
The Underground Railroad becomes more than just a network of escape routes at this point. It represents a fight for human dignity and freedom.
It was a multifaceted fight. You have people like William Lloyd Garrison publishing abolitionist newspapers,
Right.
Frederick Douglass giving powerful speeches, and countless others working tirelessly to aid escaped slaves.
It's inspiring to see how individuals, often working with very limited resources and face of intense opposition, can have such a profound impact.
Their efforts contributed to the growing divide between North and South, and ultimately set the stage for the tumultuous events leading up to the Civil War. The Underground Railroad played a significant role in pushing the nation toward this breaking point.
So we've covered the escapes, the political climate, the impact of the Fugitive Slave Act. But what about the lives of those who escaped?
Yeah.
What challenges did they face once they reached freedom?
Reaching freedom didn't mean the end of hardship.
Right.
They often faced discrimination, poverty, and the constant fear of being recaptured.
It must have been incredibly difficult to start over in a society that wasn't always welcoming.
Communities like Josiah Henson's Dawn Institute were crucial. They provided not just refuge, but education, job training, and a sense of belonging.
So it was about more than survival. It was about thriving.
The journey to freedom was also psychological and emotional. Escaped slaves had to process the trauma of their past, the loss of family, and the uncertainties of the future.
It really makes you think about the strength and resilience required to make such a journey and to rebuild a life with so much uncertainty.
It challenges us, I think, to consider the human cost of slavery and to appreciate the courage of those who fought for freedom.
And their stories resonate today as we grapple with social justice and equality.
Yeah.
The legacy of the Underground Railroad reminds us that the fight for freedom is ongoing.
It reminds us that ordinary people united by a common purpose and a belief in justice can achieve extraordinary things.
It strikes me that the Underground Railroad, it wasn't just like a historical event. It was a catalyst for change, a
Right.
spark that ignited a movement.
Absolutely. Forced a national conversation about slavery, exposed the brutality of the system, highlighted the lengths to which people would go to break free, challenged the very foundation of a nation that claimed to champion freedom while denying it to millions.
And that fight didn't end with the Civil War.
Right.
The struggle for equality and justice, it continues today.
The legacy of the Underground Railroad, I think it reminds us of the power of collective action and the importance of empathy and compassion in the pursuit of a more just world.
It really makes you think, if you were living during those times, what would you do? Would you risk everything to help someone escape to freedom? Would you challenge unjust laws?
Those aren't just historical questions, are they? They resonate with us today. In a world where injustice and inequality still exist, what are we willing to do to make a difference? What risks are we willing to take to stand up for what's right?
It seems like the Underground Railroad wasn't just about, escaping physical bondage.
Right.
It was also about breaking free from the shackles of apathy, indifference, and complicity.
Recognizing our shared humanity and taking action to create a world where everyone has the opportunity to live a life of dignity and freedom.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive into the Underground Railroad, we encourage you to keep exploring, keep learning, and keep asking those tough questions.
Because the journey toward a more just and equitable world, it's a journey we all share.
And it's a journey worth taking. Thanks for joining us.